My name is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I am working in the year 2021 to teach the ancient system of classical liberal arts, philosophy and theology that used to be normal among Catholics. It's not normal anymore. In fact, most Catholics, and I don't care whether you're a Catholic housewife who never had a chance to finish high school, or if you're a Catholic priest or possibly even bishop, these studies that, as I said, used to be taken for granted among Catholics, which directed all areas of Catholic faith and morals and life and culture, are almost entirely lost. And we live in a society that we're all watching as it slowly unravels, or I should say quickly unravels. There is no solution for the problems of modern society. The reason I say that is you can take sides in these silly political disputes, and you can say, oh, the Republicans have the solution, oh, the Democrats have the solution, oh, this third party, they've got the solution. But they're all wrong. They're all wrong. None of them have a solution. And the reason why is because the anti-Catholic ideas upon which our nation was founded are simply working themselves out over time. They're simply working themselves out, and the culture that was inherited from our Catholic European past is no longer the culture, not just of this secular society, but it's not even the culture of modern Catholic society. And I don't care whether you go to a modern Catholic parish or if you go to a Latin Mass parish, it's the same thing. You can dress up the Mass, you can change the ceremony at Mass, but all you're doing is coloring the same culture differently, changing some of the decorations and imagining or pretending that you've changed the whole thing or that you've restored the old thing. But as I've said before, when we look at the Latin Mass crowd, as soon as we turn to other areas of their lives, we find nothing traditional, no traditional education, no traditional culture. And if we go to the modern Catholic parishes, we may find some devotion to social justice, some devotion to community life, but we find no answers for education or culture. We find the problems of secular society just spill right over into the community of the church. And for anyone looking from the outside, it appears that the church doesn't have answers to the problems that plague the greater community. Inside Catholic circles, inside Catholic families, we find all of the same problems that people have outside of Catholic families. What all of this reveals is the reality that salvation is an individual phenomenon. Salvation is about individuals. It's about individual souls being acted upon by God's grace and choosing of their own free will to receive and collaborate with that grace, working out their salvation, as St. Paul says, with fear and trembling. Salvation is an individual sport. And what modern Christians have in common, or I should say modern Catholics, is that they all imagine that somehow communities can be saved, groups can be saved, societies can be saved. And this is the fallacy at the heart of all of these modern errors. What happens when we begin to believe that a group can be saved is that we abandon the commandments given to individuals, because we believe that the individual obedience is not as important as the overall quality of the community. And we justify 1,001 acts of individual disobedience by pointing to the society and comparing it to other societies, or pointing to our group and comparing it to other groups and saying, look, isn't our group better than that group? As if groups will be saved for their relative morality or their relative superiority. There's no such teaching anywhere in sacred scripture or in sacred tradition. There's no group of people who will be saved unconditionally because they are members of a certain group. And this whole idea that groups can be saved, again, whether that group is a family or a church or a particular nation or even a group within the church, has no foundation anywhere in divine revelation, because salvation is for individuals. We can see this clearly when we look at the history of the church and consider the testimony of the saints. When we look at the saints, we find holy individuals. We find that these holy individuals lived according to the same standards of righteousness and virtue, regardless of their circumstances. They lived according to the same principles, the same standards of faith and morals, whether they lived in Catholic countries or violent anti-Catholic societies. They were not saved by their circumstances. They were not saved by their culture. They were not saved by their families. They were not saved by their cities. They were not even saved by the church. They were saved by their own individual loyalty to God, which was made possible by the grace of God. The saints are examples of the salvation of individuals. Individuals who receive grace and collaborate with that grace. The name saint, if we look at the Latin sanctus, it means one who is holy or sanctified. Only an individual can be sanctified. A group cannot be sanctified unless all of the individual members of that group are, in fact, sanctified. There's no such thing as salvation of groups or parties or clubs or cities or families or communities. Individuals are saved. And this is the gospel. The gospel is that Christ came into the world to save sinners, individuals who, by the grace of God, confess their sins, do penance, and amend their lives. Modern Catholics, as I said, have no connection to the culture of medieval Catholics. They may pretend to do so by singing some Gregorian chant or celebrating the Mass using the same liturgical rubrics. But as I said, once the wax of this makeup melts away, there's nothing similar between the faith of the doctors of the church and the saints and the faith of people who are wrapped up in political controversies, church scandals, liturgical controversies, and so on. The salvation of an individual may seem overwhelming because of the solitude that it challenges us with. But this solitude was taught by Christ himself, who modeled it for us. He himself lived a life in solitude. We often read that throughout his life, Jesus went away into the mountain to pray. Jesus understood that his mission was an individual mission. Sure, it involved other people, but he had no control over the responses of those other people. We see a perfect example of this in Judas and in many others who he appealed to and invited, just like he did his 11 faithful disciples, but others turned away and didn't follow him. Jesus modeled for us this individual life. John the Baptist modeled this individual life. The Virgin Mary modeled this individual, private, spiritual life. Many are terrified of this solitude. For many, solitude is a kind of torture. They can't live without society. And I don't mean this in a virtuous way. What I mean is their entire life, their entire personality is wrapped up in social activities. And almost everything they do is done for the sake of some social reward. And the idea of a religion that requires individual, private sacrifice is impossible for them to embrace. They're terrified of walking alone. They're terrified of thinking differently. They're terrified of taking a different route. Terrified. Many talk a good story, but when it's really time to step off the broad road, we find they're unwilling to do so. And it becomes a matter of who's got the best excuse for continuing to do what everyone else is doing. Who's got the best excuse? We look around at political affairs. We see what's going on in Afghanistan today. I hear my kids who are in the military talking about it, and all of a sudden they're confused and frustrated about what our country's doing, and I tell them, I told you so. I told you that military ambitions and the hopes of honors and respect is not the pursuit of wise men. I told you that. The wise men all tell you that. Aristotle told you that. We look at the effects of COVID and we watch as the market is turned upside down and is in flux, and there's all kinds of uncertainty. People are upset because they're not able to just run their businesses and do as they please, but decisions that are made by governments or other countries affect their ability to do business. And their whole lives are turned upside down. But all the philosophers told you that that's what business is. The ancient philosopher Cato, the Roman Cato, taught in his work on agriculture that the life of business is extremely dangerous. And that's why wise men chose to be farmers. Because although the work is toilsome and humble, it's a safe life. Safe in a virtuous sense, not safe in a cowardly sense, not safe from difficulty or safe from moral challenges, but safe from avoidable catastrophes. The philosophers told men and have always told men of these problems. And now what we see are modern men who have scoffed at the ancient philosophers, who have written them all off as old, superstitious fools, and have abandoned all of their counsel, ignore all of their experience, and rush along on paths that have never been taken before. The people today act like something strange, something unexpected, something undeserved is happening. And what's even worse than that is they imagine that something better is going to come and that it's not just going to get worse and worse the farther and farther they go from that ancient wisdom. People pretend like, oh, if we just fixed this, or if we elected Trump instead of Biden, or if we did this instead of that, then the problems are multiplying and escalating. They're growing in both number and in magnitude. And yet people are still convinced that the modern ideas and the modern methods that have brought us into this crisis on all sides of Catholic life, political crisis, domestic crisis, liturgical crisis, financial crisis, on and on. They imagine that the path they're on is going to somehow lead them out of these things as it leads them deeper and deeper into these things. And as I said, these problems that are being experienced are the consequences that the ancients warned would come to those who didn't live according to the principles of their philosophy. And it's just going to get worse, because we're living less and less according to the principles of their philosophy. But here's the real danger. Even having mentioned all of that, we haven't even begun to get to the real danger. I hope I can explain this clearly. Imagine a person is born, and this person is born into a wealthy family that has been wealthy for generations, and he grows up with access to all kinds of benefits. He's born into connections. He's born into wealth. He has access to resources and friends and relatives simply because he's born into a great family. And he reaches adulthood and he draws on all of these benefits. And as he's drawing on these benefits, he himself is choosing to abandon all of the principles and practices that his family has practiced through the generations by which all of these benefits have been accumulated. He burns bridge after bridge after bridge. And what he does is he cuts off all of his future relations from the benefits of their past relations. His own choices and decisions, dividing and breaking those supply lines, as it were, or bridges, while he continues to draw on them himself for his own supply. And he goes on confident because his supply continues. His entire life is selfish and short-sighted. And as long as there continues to remain enough for him, he considers all to be well. And yet the decisions that he's making, the changes that he's making, the traditions that he's breaking are cutting off future family members from the benefits of the past, the benefits which he himself inherited. But over time, as this life goes on, those benefits are consumed more and more. And there are signs, as he goes on his way, there are signs that he doesn't have the same resources that he had before. There are signs that things are getting worse. And yet he goes on, burning bridge after bridge, cutting supply line after supply line, breaking tradition after tradition. Just always making sure that there's still some money in the bank for next month's expenses. And this is how he lives. Living off of borrowed capital. Biting the hand that feeds him. Scoffing at the ways of his forefathers. And this kind of life has been lived by many throughout world history. It's the life that Cicero fought against in ancient Rome, as he tried to promote the ways of the forefathers, the mos maiorum, as the Romans called it, and urged the modern Romans, who were abandoning all of the philosophical principles, all of the moral standards of the ancient Romans, who are famous for their simple austerity, their Spartan-like moral standards, who are being born into inherited wealth, which the ancient way of life had created. This has happened again and again throughout history. But throughout history, there's almost always been something else left to hope in, or some deus ex machina that suddenly appeared and saved the day. But there's reason today to believe that we're getting closer and closer to a time when there's no such bailout, when these collapses and failures aren't given another chance, aren't rescued at the last minute, but are left to run to their necessary ends. And it appears more and more, I'm not saying this in any final sense, like some silly prophecy reading doomsday preacher. What I'm saying is that more and more this ancient light is going out, and it's getting darker and darker as we go. But that's still not the biggest problem. It's getting darker and darker, and the hope of recovery is growing more and more unlikely. But that's not the greatest problem. What's different today is that the commitment to the errors is more and more universal than it had been in the past. In ancient Egypt, or I should say in ancient Sumeria, there was Abraham, a righteous man, living amidst an unrighteous people. In ancient Egypt, we see Moses rise up and fill the people with hope. In ancient Israel, we have Solomon and David. We have the prophets. Notice how few they were, but nevertheless, God raised up prophets, one after another. And many times, the generation was saved by a single holy man who interceded for the people and offered his own righteous life as a reparation to God for the sins into which they had fallen. And God granted the prayers of such holy men. And this goes on through history. But when we look around today, if we look around today, we don't see these wise men. We see that many are looking for these wise men. But the men who are followed and latched onto are pretenders. They're men who themselves are caught up in the controversies of their generation. They're not like saints or prophets. They're not like the ancient philosophers. The wise men of history always lived with a detachment from the current affairs. They always lived a life that was transcendent. They lived in a realm of thought and life that hovered above the society and wasn't muddied with all of the controversies and fads and schisms of their generation. Consider a man like Socrates, who, though he lived in ancient Athens and all the Greek cities, took pride in their individual cities and boasted of their citizenship. Though there really was no such thing as Greece, there was never a Greek nation, just a collection of cities. While his fellow Greeks fought for the supremacy of this city or this city, while they divided and fought with one another over which city was greater than the other, Socrates stood above all of that squabbling and fighting and called himself a citizen of the world. He spoke of a life that transcended all of those political controversies. He was a citizen of the world, not of any particular city. And he wasn't interested in those divisions or quarrels. He was a human being. And he pursued those things which were proper for human beings. Most of all, wisdom and virtue. He didn't believe in the salvation or happiness of any city, but only in the happiness of individual souls whose lives were rightly ordered. the happiness of the virtuous life, which can only be known by an individual. The holy men of ancient times, the wise men of ancient times, always dwelt in solitude, separated, exalted, and they were often persecuted and mistreated, and the book of Hebrews speaks of those kinds of men and says they were men of whom the world was not worthy. And this is where the ideal of saints, men who are separated, men who are assumed into heaven by God, men who are destined for everlasting glory after this life, in a world to come, a world where they belong, a world they deserve. This is the image of the saints in Christian theology, but also of the wise men in ancient philosophy and of the prophets in ancient Judaism. They were transcendent, free men free of worldly entanglements, men free of political controversies, men free of material cares. Free men, true free men. And they weren't free because they liked to read books or because they called themselves free. They were known to be free by their manner of life, by the topics they talked about, by the way they lived, by their solitude, by their individual virtue. They were free from the vices and troubles of their peers. St. Paul says, "Whoever a man presents himself to in obedience, he is that man's slave." Whoever a man presents himself to in obedience is that man's slave. And by obedience is meant this idea of subjection, the subjection of the will of one man to another. But we can understand this in a greater and metaphorical sense if we consider obedience to some desire, to some influence, to some party, to some group, to some cause, to some idea. Whatever a man presents himself to in obedience, he is a slave to that thing. And therefore, a man who is gluttonous, for example, is a slave to his desires for pleasure from food. He is not a free man who is a glutton, but he is a slave. And his inability to do his will is the proof that he is not a free man. A man who is given over to lust, who lives an immoral life, looking at pornography, participating in any vicious, lustful behavior, is a slave of that behavior. He'll say, "I don't want to do it." And as he says so, he confesses himself to be a slave. a slave of his lusts. He's not a free man. Any vice which we can't control in ourselves, any vice which is more powerful and controlling than our own will, is our master. And any man who is enslaved to a vice is not a free man. And this freedom from subjection, freedom from some other power, is what marks the true free man. And we don't see such men in this generation. Even those who are considered to be leaders or speakers or celebrities, we find them subject to the same weaknesses, entangled in the same controversies, trapped by the same temptations. And that's one important difference between the darkness of this generation and the hope that other generations had. Everyone can point out someone they like. They can say, oh, look at this person. He's faithful. He's a free man. But all that they mean is that he agrees with their opinions. We'll find him entrapped in the same problems as others. We see this time and time again as these celebrities that are put up on a pedestal eventually crash and burn. This is the norm in modern society. Where are the wise men? Where are the men like the ancient prophets or the apostles or the saints? Where are the ancient philosophers? Men like Pythagoras and Plato, Cicero and Seneca. Where are the wise, transcendent men that we can look to, who continue to teach the truth, who continue to maintain the traditions? And again, don't get this word tradition wrapped up with the Latin Mass culture. I'm talking deeper and more substantial traditions, philosophical traditions, not mere ceremonial or liturgical traditions, which can change. The traditions of sound moral and natural philosophy, the traditions of sound Catholic theology, rooted in sacred scripture and sacred tradition. Where men know what they believe and can give the reasons for their beliefs rather than pass around links to YouTube videos or links to books available on Amazon, which today is all I seem to get from anyone. When I ask a question, I can never get a man who has an opinion to give me a proof, to demonstrate his opinion. I get a link to some wacky YouTube video. I get a meme. Or I get a link to a book. As if the argument requires an entire book. Modern men don't even understand how to prove something. They don't even understand how reasoning works. They don't understand how a discussion works. If a man writes a thesis, when another man responds, he doesn't point out a fault in an argument. He doesn't point out the falsehood of a proposition. He simply responds with his own thesis, starting the conversation all over again. And this just goes on forever. Men don't even know how to have a conversation that brings any profit, or that draws any helpful conclusions, or resolves any controversial issues. They just wrangle on and on to hear themselves on every topic. For example, if I post a talk like this, I take the role of what's called a respondent. I'm responding usually to some question. And if you watch the comments, you'll never see someone say, "Hey, Mr. Michael, there's one statement you made in this part of the talk, and I can demonstrate that that statement you made is not true, and therefore the conclusion drawn from it is not necessary, or is not conclusive." And we could examine that objection to see whether it's true that I asserted something falsely, which is helpful because it's true. If I do assert something that's false and then use that as a proposition for some argument, and that leads to a conclusion, while logically that doesn't prove that the conclusion is false, it does show that that argument is not the source of that conclusion. And that conclusion yet remains to be proven. So an objection to something that's been asserted with proof that it's not certain is helpful. Likewise, if someone were to show that an argument that I made logically, or a conclusion that I made, I should say, to be more clear, if someone were to argue that a conclusion that I drew in one of my talks logically did not follow from the assumptions that I had started from, that would be a helpful objection. Because if it was true that a conclusion did not follow from some propositions, again, while the conclusion would not therefore be false, it would remain unproven at that point. And that would be helpful. But those kinds of responses are not what we find in the comments. One person, a Catholic woman, recently commented on one of my articles that after reading the first few lines, she realized that I was just a quote-unquote pompous ass. And she didn't even bother to read the rest of the article after the first few lines. And she posts that as a comment, as if that's some kind of intelligent response. It's not a response. It's just a waste of everybody's time, including her own. To make a character assessment, to even confess, to admit that one makes a character assessment after reading a few lines of an article of several thousand words, is not a judgment of the author of the article, but of the person commenting. This is a person who makes character judgments without even listening to what someone has to say. That's not a judgment of me. That's a judgment of that commenter. And that doesn't impress anyone. But that's the normal kind of responses that we see in society, because we live in a society that cannot communicate, that can't discuss controversial issues. They simply don't know how. Because in all of their studies, in all of their schooling, they don't study the art of reasoning. They don't practice the art of disputation. They don't learn to write theses. And that's why I say this generation is not like other generations. It's darker. It's darker. And the real danger is that truth is complex. Truth is complex. Everyone likes to say that the truth is simple, but that's false. The truth is complex. This is explained by Aristotle when he talks about the natural method by which we learn things. Our appearances are all deceiving. Our senses mislead us. When we see things, they appear to be wholes, but when we examine them, we find that they're actually compounds of all kinds of complex moving parts. And this is true not only of physical bodies, physical things, living things, it's also true of ideas. We talk about ideas as if they're simple. Even when we haven't studied them carefully, we talk about them as if we know them, simply because we've heard the word before. But we don't investigate them. We don't analyze them. We just assume that we know things that are far more complex than we allow them to be. And what happens over time in a person's life is that in each phase of our lives, we're to grow in our ability to understand that complexity. We're to understand the increasing complexity of the truth, step by step, either by true education or by the experience of our lives and studies. And we're to be constantly attending to this intellectual growth through study and meditation as we grow through life. And we're to develop an increasingly complex understanding of things, so that when we're in our older years, in our 60s and 70s, we'll have the subtlety of mind to understand the truth in its complexity and will be valuable in counseling those younger than us. who are unable to understand that complexity. The assumption is that the older men have devoted their lives to the pursuit of this wisdom, this complexity. We assume that men are doing that. We assume that men are devoting their lives to the accumulation of wisdom. And then when they're old, we assume that because they were supposed to have been pursuing wisdom and have reached these great years, that they should have something to offer those who are younger, the next generation. But when we look around, how many men do we find who are actually pursuing wisdom in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s? We see men in their 40s watching sports on television like children. We see men in their 50s still trying to be cool. We see men in their 60s just playing, wasting money that they've earned, traveling, entertaining themselves, buying things, still at 60. Men who have never devoted themselves to the pursuit of wisdom. And though they be 60 years old in body, they're teenagers in mind. That's what's dark about this generation. A generation where men, older men, are talking about Viagra rather than virtue. I remember reading in Cicero's work, just to show the difference in the minds of men. And I realized that Cicero is an extraordinary man. I don't pretend that he was common in ancient Rome. But I remember when I was younger and I was reading Cicero's philosophical treatise on old age. It's called De Senectute in Latin. His treatise on old age. And Cicero was writing about the benefits of old age. And he said, basically, he couldn't wait to be an old man because he looked forward to the days when all of the lustful desires of youth would be gone. And he would be free as an old man to pursue wisdom without the distractions of his natural youthful lusts and bodily desires. He looked forward to old age. Because while he wanted to be free from those things as a young man, he knew that they were natural and had to be fought against. But he looked forward to the day when nature would lead him beyond those desires so that he could be free to study and meditate. And old age was something that wise young men looked forward to. And you consider the longing of Cicero for the days of older age so that he could enjoy life without the distractions of physical desires, and compare that to the modern man in his 50s and 60s watching pornography and taking drugs that help him be more lustful, actually seeking greater distraction, as nature is working to take those distractions away from him, artificially keeping those distractions alive. That's the modern old man. And that's what's dark about our society. And what's happening is the complexity of the truth is making the truth, or moving the truth, further and further from an ignorant, vulgar, lazy generation of men. And the further that we get from that truth, the more unlikely it is that we can ever reach it. And this is not a problem only for individual men, but because the decisions and the choices and the actions and the works of those men have consequences for the future. The next generation inherits many disadvantages, inherits profound ignorance, intellectual darkness, has no access to wisdom or to the benefits of thoughtful experience in older men, but is forced to live by trial and error, which is the way of foolishness. And that's why, again, it's getting darker and darker. What wise men can you call upon for counsel in any practical dilemma you face? Where is the wise man that you can write to or email or give a phone call to get some experienced, wise, virtuous advice in life? Very few young men or women have any such people to call upon. And that's again why I think our society is getting darker and darker. Almost everyone I see having children is starting a family with ideas and fantasies and almost no old counsel. Every family that's created is as if it's the first family to ever exist. All theoretical, all ideological, very impractical, devoid of any experienced, weathered, tested, mature counsel. And this is the norm in modern generations. They merely parrot what they hear from the politicians, from the professionals, from the pastors. It's just parroting sound bites, catchphrases, fad terms, and so on. No proofs, no sources, no evidence, no demonstration, just repeating what their selected advisors have said to them. And it's important to note that these advisors are selected because they're not seeking counsel from some authority. They choose their teachers and then quote them as if the words of the teachers they've chosen are proof enough, where that's just a circular argument, irrational. And this is common today. It's getting darker and darker. It's worth noting that St. Paul, 2,000 years ago, said that in the end times, and again, I'm not speaking of end times with any kind of finality, as if the end is near, for none of us have any idea. God could at any moment raise up a new prophet, a new saint, a new doctor, to lead the church, transform the church the way that St. Francis did in the Middle Ages. Anything is possible with God. And God could do that. And we could find a time of Christian prosperity and flowering of Christian culture that lasts for 500 years. I pray that is what happens. But there's no explanation for why things are as dark as they are. No explanation. There's no explanation for why ignorance among Christian people is so profound. If we look at schools, there's no explanation for why they all of them, follow the same failed and beaten path that offers them no hope, no promise, unless they just delude themselves, telling themselves that where this path has led others, it won't lead them. And yet it does. Decade after decade after decade. At the heart of the problem in modern society is a rejection of the principles of the wise ancient philosophers, prophets, apostles, and saints. The irrational and self-spiting confidence that's professed in modern institutions, modern ideas, modern philosophies, modern methods, modern schools, modern domestic arrangements, and so on, is just impossible to understand. The influences that injure us are not abandoned as we experience the injuries they cause, but they're committed to more and more zealously, as if the problem is simply that we don't have enough of them. And it just gets darker and darker, and that's why It's not surprising at all to see our generation increasingly concerned about mental health, because people are literally going crazy. Our society, as it continues down this path, while with its mouth it speaks with all confidence, is literally going crazy. We talk about depression as if it's something normal. We talk about Christians who are on medication to deal with depression as if that's something normal. As if depression is just another physical condition produced by these defective bodies that continue to evolve into something unknown from something unknown. And so though we've abandoned the ancient ideas, we've rejected the ancient philosophy, we've moved away from the ancient religion, we find ourselves not in a state of greater joy and liberty, but we find ourselves as a society filled with depression. And we listen as the naturalists tell us that this is just some effect of some material cause which can be remedied with some material medicines. And we say, ah, yes, my problem is that I simply don't have enough of this modern philosophy. I just need more of it. If only I can get more of it, then these problems will go away. And this is how the mind of an addict works. Yes, this heroin has destroyed my whole life and I feel terrible and I'm sick and my body's filled with these pains. But that's because I just need some heroin. If I can just get some heroin, all of these effects of heroin will go away. That's the mind of an addict. And modern people, Christians included, are addicted to modernity, addicted to modern ideas which have destroyed almost every part of our society, have destroyed schools, have destroyed government, have destroyed families, have destroyed markets and business. The ideas that have destroyed things, if we talk about them, if we examine them, we'll find that the modern people simultaneously complain about them and commit to them more zealously than before. And part of the reason for this is that they don't even know and can't conceive of what ideas existed before these modern ideas spread through society. The only hope for overcoming that ignorance, that deep ignorance that's going to get darker and darker with each generation is education. And by education, I don't mean getting more modern ideas through more modern education. I mean coming away from that modern culture and education and learning the ideas of the ancients. Learning how people thought and lived before these modern ideas spread through society and destroyed so much. And what's dangerous, especially dangerous, is that this knowledge of the wisdom of the ancients, though it's more readily accessible to us than ever in history, is more and more neglected by every generation. And as I said at the beginning of this talk, this is not something that our society is going to do. This is not something that the church is going to do. This is not something that any group or city or nation is going to do. This is something that we as individuals need to do. We as individuals need to take up the study of ancient wisdom. The only wisdom, for there is no other wisdom than that wisdom which was known and enjoyed by the ancient philosophers and prophets and apostles and saints. We need, as individuals, to look back to the writings of the wise, to learn from them, to follow what St. Paul says when he says in Romans chapter 12, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. That's Romans chapter 12, verse 2, if you'd like to look it up. If we were responsible to save our society or to save our generation, it would be a most depressing prospect. But we're not charged with that duty. We're not charged with the duty of saving a society or saving a nation or a city or even our own family. We're charged with the salvation of our own individual souls. And if and when, by God's grace, we are able to reach wisdom and have that wisdom work through our lives, the life that will be produced by that wisdom will be what leads others to that same wisdom. We can't stand without it in the world and tell others to go get it. We have to go get it. And having obtained it, we can then introduce others to it. And the fruits of that wisdom in our own lives should make it attractive to them as well, and make it one step easier for them to pursue than it was for us, because they'll have one advantage that we don't have. They'll have the advantage of our help. And we should look forward to that day when, in our later years, after many years of study and meditation, many sacrifices, vigils, sacrificing sleep, sacrificing pleasures for the sake of study and meditation, we can look forward to those years when, in our old age, we can turn around and help someone younger than us find what they seek with greater convenience than we'll be able to find it with. And that should be our goal. But first of all, as I said, before we worry about giving anything to anyone else, we have to obtain it ourselves. Thankfully, God's grace works with individuals. And we don't need an army to accomplish any great task, because Scripture teaches us that God can save by many or by few. And even a few wise men can have a profound effect on a society. We see this all through history. But we've got to make the choice to become those wise men. We have to pray for wisdom, but we also have to work for wisdom. And to work for wisdom, we have to study. And to study, we have to study the writings of the wise. We have to study the classical liberal arts. We have to study classical philosophy. We have to study Catholic theology, not just to be familiar with things so that we can gab and pretend we're smart. We have to study them so that we can understand the complexity of the truth, so that we can think like mature men and women and can help those who are simple. I hope that's helpful. I hope that it's encouraging. Please know that in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, this is what we're pursuing. And we invite anyone who's interested in pursuing wisdom to join us. Whether you're wealthy or poor, you're welcome. And we have resources and services available to help anyone who's interested in seeking wisdom. Visit us on our website at classicalliberalarts.com, or contact me anytime. You can contact me by email by writing to mail@classicalliberalarts.com. If you go on the Academy website, you can see my personal contact information, including my phone number. Please feel free to text or call me anytime. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.